Kyle Newman. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Mary.
Thank you for doing this. All right, so let's get right into it. Your debut collection, you've published three collections, two self-published, one with the publisher out of San Francisco, which is something I'll get to later. But the debut was striking to me because it's substantial. You have 54 poems, correct? Divided into 9 section or innings, for baseball fans, and because you're a sports writer. Tell me about the genesis of this first collection, While Dreaming of Diamonds in Wintertime.
So I would say that's really like me, trying to establish myself and find my voice as a very young poet. I mean, I consider myself still a young poet at 30, but that was in college at Arizona State. And, I was going to school for journalism and for poetry. So pursuing both majors at the same time. And, all the rational part of me being like, okay, I want to be a sports writer. That's maybe how I'll pay my bills. But then kind of the dreamy part of me being like, hey, I want to be a poet. Like, I think I'm pretty good at this. I want to take this seriously. So I wrote that whole collection while I was in college, and it got published shortly after I graduated. I decided to go the self-publishing route because, well, as you know, Mary, and I quickly found out in college, the publishing game in poetry is pretty tough. So the dreamy dreams of like, oh yeah, I'll just write a collection, get it published. Well, that turned out to be a little more difficult than that. But it was great. It was a great breeding ground, just putting together the whole manuscript for me in terms of finding myself as a poet, like I said, and just going through the process of from submitting to individual literary publications, big and small across the country, to trying to pitch your manuscript and get that looked at, and then just the process of putting together a manuscript. And the best poetry collections you or I have read, it's not just a hodgepodge of poems. It's coherent. The poems flow from one to the next, just like a good hip hop album would. So finding that rhythm, finding the themes I wanted to explore, that was kind of all the basis for that. And I'll say, even looking back, I was just reading a few of them just now. I'd say as poets, artists in general, we tend to be more critical the further we get from works. And the stuff we did when we were younger, we kind of shrug it off. But I'm still pretty proud of it, and I'm proud of the way I was able to kind of translate baseball into an underlying theme there, like you said. So divided into 9 innings, there's 54 poems, and there's 54 outs in a 9-inning baseball game. So a poem for an out in the game. So using that as kind of the underlying theme, and I believe most of the poems contain baseball, which I tried to kind of shift away from my latter collections. But that was really just kind of the genesis for me as a poet.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know 54 outs, so I learned something. I'm not a baseball fan, so I learned
I'm
something.
learning a couple things about baseball here today, right?
Do you remember? Because readers, especially aspiring poets, would be interested in this. Do you remember, on average, how many publishing houses you submitted your work to? How many magazines you submitted your work to? Just an estimate.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked, because I talk about this, like if I go into classes to talk about poetry, I'll talk about the submission process a lot. So in college, I don't have the exact number, but it was hundreds. And I can tell you, in the last 4 years, I've kept a running spreadsheet. Just every time I submit, I put the name in there. If I get the reception or exception or rejection, I indicate that. And over the last 4 years, it's probably been like 500, basically like everyone I can find. And then like coming back to those after the period of, okay, once we've denied you, please do not submit for 6 more months. And hey, the acceptance rate in college was probably, I mean, maybe a little lower. It's probably like 1 or 2% in college, and it's like 2 or 4% now. But on that note, and I'm sure you maybe feel the same way. Like, I try not to get discouraged at all by rejections, and a lot of some literary magazines, they can't all give critique, but maybe a line or two here or there to, hey, we didn't like it, but we couldn't accept it, but we like this. So those little things keep you going throughout the process.
Good, good. So going back to that self-publication issue. So again, you self-published your first two works with Create Space, but you published the third with Naciona. I think I'm saying that correct.
The Nishonya.
Nishonia, thank you.
Yeah.
A publishing house that specializes in publishing works by writers of color. For you, you know, a professional journalist and someone who had already published twice, how was that experience different? Did you feel that you had as much creative freedom with this publishing house as you had on your own?
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, you addressed that it was for writers of color, and that's kind of like the identity it's taken on. And obviously, I don't fit into that category, but I think Julian, the editor there, he felt like the commentary on fatherhood, which we can talk about later, and just kind of suburban life, would be a good fit. But to answer your question, Mary, I mean, I didn't I it was a great relationship Julian and I had in kind of the process. I mean, I had the manuscript pretty much written. He made some suggestions here and there, some tweaks here and there, and then it was hugely beneficial to have the press for developing the cover. Like, I'm kind of an amateur Photoshop artist, and I did the first couple covers, but I think definitely the design and like just the presentation of the published book with the publishing house behind it turned out better than anything I could have done. Um, Now, in terms of having the publishing house behind it, it was great. It was great validation, no doubt. So, like, after the first two collections and the second collection, I really tried to get published for like a year and a half, before 2 years before I was like, okay, like, I mean, I feel like this is almost getting behind me artistically. Let's just put it out there, and I'll just focus on a new one. So to get the third collection published, it was definitely like some vindication. But as many poets will tell you, not named Billy Collins or a dead Charles Bukowski, it's not like it brought some huge financial windfall, or in the case of Nishonia, which is also kind of an up and coming publication and literary house, it didn't bring me that much so cred, so to speak, or media hype. So that, maybe the next one we can elevate it. I can elevate again, but it was a great learning experience, and I am grateful to that publishing house for taking a chance on it and putting its name behind it, because it does give it a little more, I don't know, credit. I don't want to say credibility, because like it's not like I feel if you self-publish, that doesn't mean the work is bad, but to have a publisher behind it, it's always a good feeling.
Yeah. I mean, having worked at a publishing house, I think for a lot of poets, it just takes some of the weight off of you. Like, if you
Right.
self-publish, you're responsible for distribution too, and
Right.
that's a very big task. You're responsible for marketing, and that's a very
Right.
big task. So I definitely understand, and I think a lot of other people who will watch this will understand exactly what you're talking about. So what intrigued me about you was that it's not too often that you find a sports writer. You write for the Denver Post, who is also a poet. Of course, you mentioned earlier that you'd been studying journalism and poetry in tandem during your undergrad years. The only example I was able to think of was Grantland Rice, and I don't think many people know him. He died back in the 50s. He's kind of
Well, the sports writers know him, that's for sure.
sports writers
Um,
know him. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but I think the general public might not know who he is. Um, so which came first? I mean, it's or which. So you mentioned that you've been writing poetry in college. Did the interest in sports writing come first? Did the interest in poetry come first? And how deeply does one form influence your work in the other, if at all?
I think, I mean, they're both pretty much in tandem. They've gone back in tandem since I was a little kid. I remember when I was in first grade, we had writing time, and I dedicated that time to like making a book about like teams in the NFL. But it was kind of, it was almost like prose about the teams. It was almost like sports journalism prose. So that was like kind of my first hint as like a young kid, like I like sports. I love playing sports. I love writing about sports, but I also kind of took an interest in the atypical writing. Maybe I didn't identify it as poetry as a young kid, but fast forward to high school, and to be honest, my genesis in poetry, even going back before college, when I really started taking it seriously, was listening to rap and hip hop, and not like stuff you'd maybe find on the mainstream stations, but the more underground, lyrically inclined stuff. And my first poems were really just like spoken word raps
Mm.
written on a page, and then like I'd perform them for my friends to no beat. So it was like almost like spoken word hip hop poetry ish. And I have all these, this stack of papers in an old file folder somewhere. It's just I'll go and dig it out occasionally because those are the ones where it's like, you're rhyming every line, and it's like if you're evaluating it for poetry perspective, it's truly terrible. But it was like the genesis point. So to long answer your question, I get to college, I'm like, okay, I think I want to take this poetry thing more seriously. Got into some workshops, and they're like, yeah, that's kind of rap, that's not poetry, try this and this. So I was honing that, and I'd started studying sports writing. I had started writing for the state press, the student newspaper down there. And I was kind of like, well, like I want to do both of these. Like I want to be a great sports writer, but I also want to be a great poet. Like in the dream case scenario, I win a Pulitzer in both, So like that was like the ambitious roots of it. And I after college, I basically kind of bootstrapped through journalism. I moved to Alamogordo, New Mexico, to South Bend, Indiana, before coming back to Denver, where I'm from. And jobs all along the way, and I never stopped writing poetry. I never stopped like pursuing that as a serious task. And it's, to be honest, I think that like the poetry people I talk to find it intriguing and are like, okay, cool, tell me more. The the sports writing contingent, it's more of like puzzlement. They're not really sure what to think. So which is always intriguing to like come across, and people sometimes mention it. But that's kind of like the intertwining of those two pursuits, and how even and now that I'm kind of ingrained in my journalism career, I'm even more dedicated to finding time to write poetry and to put together my next manuscript and trying to get that one published.
Mhm. Yeah, your response makes a lot of sense to me because I think that the conciseness of sports writing and of journalism, period, can be very helpful to writers, but particularly
Mhm.
to poets because it's a very compact form. You have to say a lot in a very compact form, and I think that the dynamic quality of sports writing can translate very well to poetry.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, and into sports writing too, because I mean, sports writing. Let's be honest, it's not like we're not like the hard journalists out here protecting the First Amendment, but we're entertainment writers in a sense, And when I'm writing about the Broncos and Drew Lock and his flair, or the Rockies and their tanking, what it means, like it's hyping up sports heroes in a sense. It's not it's I don't want to say it's not important. It's definitely a different type of writing, and you can be a little more creative and edgy in sports writing. And I think that's where kind of poetry flows in a little bit. My editors try and crop it out, but I'll try and sneak in like Volta in there every once in a while in the sports story. The Volta was in the seventh inning, something like that.
But sports writing is also accessible, and maybe that's where people get confused. Those in the sports writing world get confused because people still very much think that poetry is this esoteric, difficult to understand form, whereas sports writing is for the people. It's a very prosaic form.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Because yeah, I mean, most of the people who I talk to, like who think about poetry, the sports writers or the sports fans, they think about Shakespeare, or like they think about sonnets, they think about Emily Dickinson, and like bless the greats, folks who I don't ever read except when I was forced to in school. I'm a postmodernist poet. Like I like to read modern poetry, free verse, unrhymed, like. But that's not what they sense. But enough. We'll try and educate the sports writers on another show, right?
I'm curious about your hip hop influences too. You say that you liked people who were not so much mainstream, and I have an idea of who you're
Yeah.
talking about. But those who are more lyrically influenced, that makes me think of artists like Jurassic 5, Black Alicious. I mean, were some of those influences to you others?
Yeah, definitely. So some of those early 90s ones, you mentioned Jurassic 5, definitely in there. And then I would say the biggest influence, and this is for maybe hip hop fans, and maybe an obscure one, but it's a duo called Atmosphere, and they're out of Minnesota. And I mean, they're pretty big now. They've played Red Rocks all over the country, but you won't find them played on the radio. And they, he raps a lot about a lot of the same themes in my work, fatherhood and life, and addiction, and just all these. And it's lyrically inclined, and in terms of mainstream rappers right now, I would say like Chance the Rapper is kind of a good example of a guy I listen to a lot. And like really, like we're not rapping about gold and drugs and making money, like the hip hop stations in Denver, and I don't know if it's like this in New York, but I can't listen to them, because it's too much of that, and not enough lyricism. But yeah, that the hip hop definitely still influences me. I rap myself. It's kind of like a ghost pursuit, I'll say. And I've made some mixtapes. I'm working on like my first album now. So that's like tier 3 pursuit, beneath the journalism and poetry, of course.
Do you do any spoken word? Do you go to any spoken word nights?
I have not. And there's a place here in Denver called the Mercury Cafe that they're well renowned around this town for spoken word. And I've people I've talked to about poetry and rap, like, you got to do spoken word. I haven't. Do you recommend? Because I feel like that's almost like another genre unto itself. Like I got to write my raps, I got to write my poems, but then I got to write my spoken word poems, and I got to write my sports. Like it's just piling up here. But I think I'm going to do it. I should put on the list. Yeah.
I mean, spoken word, because sometimes we get some submissions for spoken word, and a lot of it doesn't always work so well on the page. But of course, there are some spoken word artists who do publish their spoken word poems. Saul Williams is somebody who comes to mind. And of course, spoken word has a tradition in toasts. Etheridge Knight, the African-American poet who was part of the Black Arts movement, did toasts. So sometimes it works on the page, and sometimes sometimes it does. I mean, you might find that you can write a poem that would work well.
Right.
In spoken
word.
Well,
I feel like I'm a decent reader of my poems, and they have good sound and rhythm. So, and I hope to back that up at the end of this interview. But so yeah, maybe I'll give that a shot. But I appreciate you putting that on my radar. I'm already learning here. You're learning about sports writing. I'm learning about poetry, history. This is great.
This is good. There's an interchange. So your third collection focuses on domestic life, while the first two, from the poems that I did see in the first two collections, seem to cast a wider net and looked at various social phenomena. And the third collection is, to me, it was a little dark in its themes. It reminded me actually of some work that I've read from John Cheever, Richard Yates, whom people know well as a novelist and a short story writer, who dealt very much with the darker aspects of American suburban life. So how did family life, particularly fatherhood, transform your poetry? Because obviously you've learned a lot since you started writing when you were at Arizona State. I mean, so how did it transform your work, both in terms of content and form? Because I found the poems in your third collection to be sharper, honestly, and more lucid than those in the first collection. But that could just be, a poet's natural progress. What changes did you see in that third collection?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of like you said, it really becoming a father and becoming a husband, just basically moving into like, that stage of my life really transformed my writing overall. It intensified, my concepts of love, of emotional love, obviously of father-son love that I hadn't had before, father-daughter love. And then really brought in just a lot of the like these self-critiquing elements and self-awareness elements that, yeah, I mean, to your point, Mary, like after I published it and I read it, for like the 100th time out, and for like the 100th time, I was like, yeah, that was a little dark. That was like, to your point, I think it was my best effort yet collectively out of the three, but it also kind of signified like, kind of where I was as a person, where I was as a writer. So um, that whole compilation just brought in, the fatherhood elements, the notion of time, the notion of memory, and really the notion of legacy, which I like am really starting to delve into. I feel like I haven't really like honed a focus for my next manuscript, but if legacy isn't at the top of the list, I mean, it surely should be, because looking at legacy as like just a human, as a father, as a husband. So yeah, that collection, I think I'll look back maybe in 50 years and hopefully with a lot more collections and say like that collection was like maybe a turning point artistically, personally, and maybe like a trampoline for getting me to the next level, and as an artist, but as a human too, and hopefully that helps me become a better artist and poet as well.
Mhm. Um, Going back to that issue of legacy, one poem, "Avoiding Gravity," which we're going to publish in the print issue, deals specifically, I thought, with paternal. The protagonist is dealing with paternal legacy, the one left to him, and the one that he will leave to his own son. It made me think a lot about not just fatherhood, but about masculinity specifically. Is there anything that you're looking to say in your works about masculinity, about American concepts of masculinity, particularly?
Yeah, and I think I, started to dive into this in my third one, husband father failure, and like I said, it's going to become an emerging theme of my next collection of kind of my writing going forward. Is that basically like ultimate legacy, ultimate, masculinity is not seen through the social perspective or even through your own lens. Often it's seen through uh like being the best father you can be, being the best husband, role model to those who need it most. Like that's kind of the masculinity concept, especially I'm exploring in this poem, "Avoiding Gravity," where basically I talk about searching, or or the protagonist, shall I say, talk about searching for the selfish gene. And I reference my father's swords, and I reference my old wishes pacing in the shadows of the attic. I bring in my son at the end of the poem. So that's kind of a common theme. And I think some of my best works is looking back and forward while looking in the present at like, that the legacy of masculinity. Like what kind of man do you want to be ultimately? Is it is it the man that your father was? Probably a lot of it, but not all of it. Is it the man that you are right now? Same thing, probably a lot of it, but not all of it. So just kind of diving into all that in my work, I think is going to be important, for me artistically, honestly, going forward.
Right. You mentioned earlier some of the writers that have influenced you. You said that you have kind of an interest in postmodernist work, free verse. You mentioned Bukowski earlier. Which writers have most influenced your poetry?
So yeah, and I mentioned Bukowski, but I try to not write at all like Bukowski, because basically when I first started writing poetry, that was like one of the first poets I read, who I come to find, oh, a lot of people don't think he's a poet and he's just kind of an outcast. But anyways, we'll get to that another time. Um, I would say my biggest influences, like poetically, have been T.R. Hummer and Norman Dubie, both of whom taught at Arizona State, but both modern poets who kind of explore some of the same themes I do. Charles Simic also, who else on my list? Charles Simic is a big one for me. Norman Dubie, I mentioned him. Stephen Dunn, Lee Young Lee, and then honestly, and I feel remiss that I didn't have any female poets written down, because I go to Poetry Daily, I mean, pretty much every day, and read, the poem of the day there. I'll peruse the archives. I'll go to literary sites, big and small, peruse the archives, and because I mean, there's so many great poems out there that inspire me and jumpstart me that aren't from a guy who, won the Pulitzer Prize. Like that, that's not a prerequisite for poetry or being inspired by poetry too. So in that vein, I like a lot of collections too. I like the best annual poetry American poetry series. I got a bunch of those on my bookshelf. Colorado Review puts out like a best of annually, which I've been trying to get into for a long time, but I enjoy reading as well. So that's kind of like my like, you know, literary roundhouse right there. And then in terms of what I'm reading right now, it's kind of like a compilation. Like I'm not actually reading a poetry book right now, but I just wrapped up this awesome book called The Gladiators, which is like a historical look at gladiators and answers every question you could possibly know, and inspired several great poems, including Summoning Spartacus, which I think I sent to you guys.
Yes.
So, and then I'm reading a football book called The Dynasty about the Patriots, and I'm reading Consider the Lobster, which is like a book of essays by David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace, who's 10 paragraphs long, never-ending paragraphs make your head spin. But that's like I literally try and look for poetry and everything, poems, sports writing, just everything I read.
Great. So getting to my favorite of your poems, which we're also publishing, Choosing You Again, seems to be a poem that focuses on love as an active choice, which is something that people are talking more about these days, getting away from more romantic notions of love and looking at it more realistically, more holistically. The final couplet is especially interesting to me as it takes the trope of chirping birds, which is a sound symbolic of a couple that is blithely in love, and turns it instead into a sound symbolic of the harmonies that couples create after a great deal of work. What was the inspiration behind this poem? Was there any particular inspiration behind it?
Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier about my other collection, my most recent one, Husband, Father, Failure, and just kind of, it being a little dark and then exploring just kind of, failures in marriage, failures in, suburbia, failures in fatherhood, and addressing those and trying to how to fix those. So this poem is like almost, like the hopeful antithesis of that, I hope. And I was inspired by it just writing it at our new house. Actually, we had moved from the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, right around Denver, to like out in the woods, basically, not like outside the city, but like in the woods, on some acres. Like basically, it was like, me and my wife's like this is what we had worked for 10, 15 years, and with our last, like this was a big deal for us. So I was sitting in the woods and just kind of like thinking about everything, and it was, so this poem is honestly deeply personal to me. Like I try and sometimes a lot play the poet, well, that's just the narrator, that's just the protagonist, like, but this, it's hard to say that about this poem. So yeah, this poem is looking at love from that perspective, like you said, of less romanticized and more actualized, and more like this is the bumps and bruises you're going to have to take, but in the end there could be a pretty sweet payoff for you. Maybe it's not birds singing a majestic song, but like it's birds like telling you, hey, keep holding on.
Great. And in that vein, you will be reading that poem for us, Choosing
Okay.
You Again.
Choosing You Again. I watch a silent film about divorce and am forced to imagine the pleas the children are making. Outside, you water potted sunflowers with all the puddles that split our grip on various walks. You've denied this sort of confessional before. Earlier, outside the bank, we ran into a con man who claimed we'd be rich if we just focused on the unhappiness of 3 other couples. But even that con man had tattered shoes, and soon he too will be shaving without a mirror right outside a marbled bathroom, somewhere in the near future, as we remember this day and all the birds chirp encouragement at the strong, stubborn lovers still hanging on.
Thank you so much, Kyle Newman.
Thank you for having me, Mary. I appreciate it.
Likewise.